They said her medals didn't belong to her. The whispers began quietly first in the corner of a small hall, then spreading like wildfire across news headlines and social media. Some called her a fraud. Others insisted the awards had been forged. For a woman who had spent years in silence, dedicating her life to duty and sacrifice, the accusations cut deeper than any wound she had endured in service. She never asked for recognition. But now, the very honor pinned to her chest was being torn apart before the world. At first, she tried to ignore it. The voices of doubt grew louder, though drowning out the truth she carried. Strangers who had never stepped into a battlefield claimed they knew her better than her own comrades. Even people she once trusted began to hesitate when her name was mentioned. What if it's true? They wondered. For the first time, she felt the weight of her story slipping away, buried under lies too powerful to fight alone. But she wasn't just a soldier with medals. She was a woman who had faced storms few could imagine, a warrior who had seen loss and still stood tall. Those medals weren't pieces of metal. They were scars etched into her soul and sealed with blood, sweat, and years of service. Yet somehow, none of that seemed to matter, not until the day everything changed. It began with a phone call she never expected, a name she never thought would appear on her screen. The accusations had reached the highest office in the country, and someone powerful was watching. And when the president himself decided to step forward, the room of doubters froze. No one could have predicted what would happen next, because, in that moment, the question wasn't just about medals, it was about truth, respect, and a revelation that would silence the crowd in a way they would never forget. The call had come late in the evening, when she was sitting alone with the medals laid out in front of her. Each one carried a memory of nights without sleep, of missions that tested every ounce of strength, of moments when she thought she wouldn't make it home. But the louder the voices outside grew, the more those memories began to feel like stories no one wanted to believe. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't asking anyone to clap for her. All she wanted was for the truth to be seen. The controversy had started small, with a reporter questioning how someone like her could have earned so many honors. The doubt quickly spread. Old photos were pulled apart, documents analyzed by people who didn't know her name a year before. They called her achievements impossible, her story too good to be true. Forums filled with strangers demanded proof, while television debates framed her as a puzzle that didn't add up. And through it all, she stayed silent, letting the storm rage around her. Her friends urged her to speak up, to defend herself. But she had always believed actions mattered more than words. She thought the truth would stand on its own. Instead, it was slipping away. Even her family felt the sting of the accusations, watching neighbors turn skeptical, children at school whispering. The weight of it all pressed heavily, but she kept holding on to the belief that one day it would all come to light. And then the president's office made the first move. Why now? Why her? The questions swirled as she prepared to face a moment she never imagined. Because once the highest voice in the land stepped in, the story was no longer just about medals. It was about something much bigger. She remembered the first time she held one of those medals in her hands. It wasn't a grand ceremony or a room filled with cameras. It was a quiet moment. Just a few words of acknowledgement from those who had seen her fight, sacrifice, and keep moving when others would have given up. To her, the medal wasn't a decoration. It was a reminder of the people she had stood beside, of the promises she had kept even when it cost her dearly. That was why the accusations hurt so much, because they didn't just question the medal. They questioned the life behind it. The rumors only grew when a few voices from her past stayed silent. Some of the men she had once worked with refused to comment, not out of malice, but out of fear of being dragged into the chaos. Their silence was twisted into suspicion. Headlines painted her as someone with secrets to hide. Night after night, She turned on the television only to see her own picture splashed across the screen with words like fake, fraud, and liar written beside it. The world seemed determined to erase everything she had lived through. Yet in private, those who truly knew her, the quiet voices who had seen her courage firsthand, stood by her. They didn't need to defend her because they knew what she had. Done still, their support was drowned out by the roar of doubt. She could feel the walls closing in, her story being rewritten by strangers who had never stepped into her shoes. And then came the president's involvement, a twist that no one saw coming. But his interest wasn't casual, nor was it for headlines. Something in her story had reached him personally. What that was, and why he chose to act, remained a mystery she herself was only beginning to uncover. The day she was called to the Capitol felt unreal. The city itself seemed to hum with tension, as if it already knew her story was reaching a breaking point. Cameras were everywhere, waiting to capture her every step. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, some carrying signs that called her a hero, others waving posters that branded her a fraud. She walked through them in silence, her medals tucked carefully inside a small case. The very symbols of honor that had now become the center of so much doubt. Inside, the halls echoed with whispers. Officials exchanged quiet glances as she passed, their expressions unreadable. Every move she made felt heavy, as though the weight of the entire nation was pressing down on her shoulders. She was escorted into a grand chamber where advisors, military leaders, and reporters filled the room. At the far end sat the president, his face calm but serious. The air was so tense, it felt as though no one dared to breathe too loudly. The president began not with accusations, but with questions. He wanted details, stories, moments that only someone who had lived through them could recall. Each answer she gave seemed to deepen the silence in the room. Some leaned forward, listening closely, while others scribbled notes, waiting to twist her words into new doubts. She could feel the skepticism still circling, waiting for her to falter. And then, without warning, the president called for something no one had anticipated. The request sent murmurs rippling through the chamber. Reporters raising their cameras, officials shifting uneasily in their seats. In that instant, she realized the next few moments would either strip away everything she had ever stood for, finally prove the truth she had carried all along. The room seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of revelation. The chamber went silent as everyone waited for the president's request to be carried out. But before she could even process what was happening, another voice broke through the stillness. From the back of the room, a figure stepped forward, someone she hadn't seen in years. He was a decorated officer, once part of the very missions that had earned her those medals. His sudden appearance sent a wave of shock across the room. Some gasped, others whispered, and the reporters nearly stumbled over each other, trying to capture the moment. But instead of offering the support she thought he would, his words sliced through the air like a blade. He questioned her story directly, challenging the version of events she had just given to the president. He spoke with authority, his uniform gleaming under the lights. And in a single statement, he reignited every doubt that had ever been cast on her name. For a moment, it felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted, as though the walls of truth she had built were collapsing once again. The tension in the room doubled. On one side, people began nodding, convinced they had just witnessed her unraveling. On the other, a handful of faces looked torn, unsure of who to believe. Even the president's expression grew unreadable, his hands folded tightly as he studied. The confrontation, the stakes were no longer just about medals or honor. They had become a test of memory, loyalty, and credibility in front of the entire nation. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, realizing the battle was no longer against nameless doubters online or distant reporters. Now it was someone from her own past, someone who could alter everything with a single accusation. The room waited for her to respond, but before she could, the president raised his hand, signaling for silence. Something bigger was about to unfold, and no one could predict what would come next. The chamber felt like it was about to erupt when the president finally stood. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of finality. He turned first to the officer who had challenged her, asking pointed questions that only someone who had truly been present in those moments could answer. The officer's confidence wavered. His answers were rehearsed, polished for the cameras, but they lacked the raw details, the small, unforgettable truths of battle that only real experience leaves behind. Then the president shifted his attention to her. He asked her to recount the same events once more, in her own words. This time she spoke without hesitation, her voice clear and steady, painting scenes so vivid the room seemed to fall into silence. She described not just the victories, but the fear, the cold nights, the faces of those who never returned. Her story wasn't perfect or polished, which human, real, and undeniable. And with every word, the officer who had stood against her began to shrink under the weight of his own deck.